do.
Yeah. There you go.
Sure, man. Whoa. Got yourself a bargain?
They're just a pair of trainers, sir. I don't need them anymore.
All right, let's have a look. Come on. Very nice. You'd almost think they were the real deal. You do know it's illegal to sell counterfeit goods, don't you? Just don't let Mrs. Drake catch you. All right. You all right, mate? What's up?
Don't ask. Someone stole my bank card and spent like $4 grand on it.
Yeah. Oh, could be worse, though.
Oh, it is. You want to see the interest that's piling up?
Did none of that show up on your statements?
Well, yeah, that's what I said. I can't remember the last bank statement that they sent me. I just don't get it. I don't even use the card, you know? It's just for emergencies. As far as I know, the card is in my drawer at home.
Right. Listen, I don't want to cause any trouble, but I think you need to have a word with your boy.
Is it true you've been selling stuff in school?
Oh, come on. Everyone knows they're fake, so I'm technically not ripping people off.
Yeah? And where'd you get your stuff from?
You can find anything on the internet if you know where to look. Got a couple of baseball caps to start off with. Sold them straight. So, I got more stuff.
What, by using my credit card?
What? No.
Yeah, I wouldn't go on Dragon's Den with that business plan. What do you think it was? Free money?
I didn't take your car.
Ashton, don't lie to me.
I'm not.
You know, I'm already into my overdraft. I can't even cover the interest on the debt that you run up. I don't even know what I'm going to cut back on. It's going to hurt all of us. You know, you think about that. Okay, you think about that, and you come and find me when you want to tell me the truth.
I am.
Get to class. Hey. What is it? Okay?
It was me. I used your credit card. It started months ago. I didn't realise how much I'd spent. I promise I'll help you pay it back.
What'd you spend it on?
Stupid stuff.
Stupid stuff? Great, Izzy, just great.
Stuff to make me feel better.
Better than what?
Than being sad. All the time. About Mum.
Did going to Mika's not help with anything?
No. Just made it worse. I just felt lonely.
Izzy. Hey. Why don't you say anything?
I shouldn't still feel like this.
Why not? Hey. Izzy, look, it's never gonna be all right. Why, okay? Not ever.
So we'll just be sad forever.
No, darling. Only sometimes. Come here. You'll be all right.
What about Ashton?
I'll talk to him.
He's not been back since lunch.
Great. Where is he then?
I know he said something about car insurance.
Oh, no. Okay.
It's round here somewhere.
You sure?
Yeah.
What does it say on the tracker?
Just keep going. Keep going round.
Where now?
Right here.
Right. Sure?
Yeah, pretty sure.
Come on, it's got to be around here somewhere.
Look, he's there.
What's he doing? Stay there. Ashton! Ashton! What have you done? I knew you were angry.
No! That's not why. Look, it's for the insurance.
Insurance? What do you mean insurance?
You'll get the replacement costs for the tools as well. Enough to pay off the debt and get a new car. It's gonna be all right.
Come on. We need to go now, come on. Get in the car! Come on! Both of you! It's done. Let's get out of here. Are you sure there's no cameras on the street?
Yeah, that's why I parked it there.
Okay, then I suppose we just wait for the police to call.
Well, you're gonna get the insurance.
Well, technically, my truck did get stolen and destroyed, Ashton. Wipe that grin off your face.
Yeah, Ashton.
But this isn't a win. It's just a way to get a fresh start. But we can't go on like this. Right, you need to tell me what is going on in your stupid little heads. And I need to listen. Look, we will find a way to make this family work, okay? I promise. I just don't know how yet. But I will. Just bear with me, all right? Okay?